Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another reading from Primo Levi's Moments of Reprieve. I'm hoping that you're all well and eating well during this lockdown and looking after yourselves. And today's story is called Last Christmas of the Year, of the War, sorry, Last Christmas of the War. In more ways than one, Monowitz, a part of Auschwitz, was not a typical camp. The barrier that separated us from the world, symbolized by a double barbed wire fence, was not hermetic as elsewhere. Our work brought us into daily contact with people who were free, or at least less slaves than we were. Technicians, German engineers and foremen, Russian and Polish workers, English, American, French and Italian prisoners of war. Officially, they were forbidden to talk to us, the pariahs of KZ, Konzentrationszentrum. But the prohibition was constantly ignored, and what's more, news from the free world reached us through 1,000 channels. In the factory trash bins, we found copies of the daily papers, sometimes 2 or 3 days old and rain-soaked. And in them, we read with trepidation the German bulletins, mutilated, censored, euphemistic, yet eloquent. The Allied POWs listened secretly to Radio London, and even more secretly brought us the news, and it was exhilarating. In December 1944, the Russians had entered Hungary and Poland. The English were in the Romagna. The Americans were heavily engaged in the Ardennes, but were winning in the Pacific against Japan. At any rate, there was no real need of news from far away to find out how the war was going. At night, when all the noises of the camp had died down, we heard the thunder of the artillery coming closer and closer. The front was no more than 100 kilometers away. A rumor spread that the Red Army was already in the West Carpathians. The enormous factory in which we worked had been bombed from the air several times with vicious and scientific precision. One bomb, only one, on the central power plant, putting it out of commission for 2 weeks. As soon as the damage was repaired and the stack began belching smoke again, another bomb, and so on. It was clear that the Russians, or the Allies in concert with the Russians, intended to stop production but not destroy the plants. These they wanted to capture intact at the end of the war, as indeed they did. Today, that is Poland's largest synthetic rubber factory. Active anti-aircraft defense was non-existent. No pursuing planes were to be seen. There were guns on roofs, but they didn't fire. Perhaps they no longer had ammunition. In short, Germany was moribund, but the Germans didn't notice. After the attempt on Hitler in July, the country lived in a state of terror. A denunciation, an absence from work, an incautious word was sufficient to land you in the hands of the Gestapo as a defeatist. Therefore, both soldiers and civilians fulfilled their tasks as usual, driven at once by fear and an innate sense of discipline. A fanatical and suicidal Germany terrorized a Germany that was by now discouraged and profoundly defeated. A short time before, towards the end of October, we'd had the opportunity to observe a close-up of a singular school of fanaticism, a typical example of Nazi training. On some unused land next to our camp, a Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth encampment, had been set up. There were possibly 200 adolescents, still almost children. In the mornings, they practiced flag raising, sang belligerent hymns, and armed with ancient muskets were put through marching and shooting drills. We understood later that they were being prepared for enrollment in the Volkssturm, that ragtag army of old men and children that, according to the Führer's mad last plans, was supposed to put up a last-ditch defense against the advancing Russians. But sometimes in the afternoons, their instructors, who were SS veterans, would bring them to see us as we worked clearing away rubble from the bombings or erecting slapdash and useless little protective walls of brick or sandbags. They led them among us on a guided tour and lectured them in loud voices, as if we had neither ears to hear nor intelligence to understand. These that you see are the enemies of the Reich, your enemies. Take a good look at them. Would you call them men? They are Untermenschen, submen. They stink because they don't wash. They're in rags because they don't take care of themselves. What's more, many of them don't even understand German. They are subversives, bandits, street thieves from the four corners of Europe. But we have rendered them harmless. Now they work for us, but they are good only for the most primitive work. Moreover, it is only right that they should repair the war damages. These are the people who wanted the war, the Jews, the communists, and the agents of the plutocracies. The child soldiers listened, devout and dazed. Seen close up, they inspired both pain and horror. They were haggard and frightened, yet they looked at us with intense hatred. So we were the ones guilty for all the evils, the cities in ruins, the famine, their dead fathers on the Russian front. The Führer was stern, but just, and it was just to serve him. At that time, I worked as a specialist in a chemical laboratory inside the plant. But these are things that I've written about elsewhere. Strangely, with the passing of the years, these memories do not fade, nor do they thin out. They become enriched with details I thought were forgotten, which sometimes acquire meaning in the light of other people's memories from letters I receive or books I read. It was snowing. It was very cold. And working in that laboratory was not easy. At times, the heating system didn't work, and at night, ice would form, bursting the phials of reagents and the big bottle of distilled water. Often, we lacked the raw materials or reagents necessary for analyses, and it was necessary to improvise or produce what was missing on the spot. There was no ethyl acetate for a colorimetric measurement. The laboratory head told me to prepare a liter of it and gave me the needed acetic acid and ethyl alcohol. It is a simple procedure. I had done it in Turin in my organic preparations course in 1941, only 3 years before, but it seemed like 3,000. Everything went smoothly up to the final distillation. But at that point, suddenly, the water stopped running. This could have ended in a small disaster because I was using a glass refrigerator. If the water returned, the refrigerating tube, which had been heated on the inside by the product's vapor, would certainly have shattered on contact with the icy water. I turned off the faucet, found a small pail, filled it with distilled water, and immersed in it the small pump of a Hoppler thermostat. The pump pushed the water into the refrigerator, and the hot water fell into the pail as it came out. Everything went well for a few minutes. Then I noticed that the ethyl acetate was no longer condensing. Almost all of it was coming out of the pipe in the form of vapor. I had been able only to find a small amount of distilled water. There was no other, and by now it had become warm. What to do? There was a lot of snow on the windowsills, so I made balls with it and put them into the pail one by one. While I was busy with my grey snowballs, Dr. Panwitz, the German chemist who had subjected me to a singular state examination to determine whether my professional knowledge was sufficient, came into the lab. He was a fanatical Nazi. He looked suspiciously at my makeshift installation and the murky water that could have damaged the precious pump, but said nothing and left. A few days later, towards the middle of December, the basin of one of the suction hoods was blocked, and the chief told me to unplug it. It seemed natural to him that the dirty job should fall to me and not to the lab technician, a girl called Frau Meyer. And actually, it seemed natural to me too. I was the only one who could stretch out serenely on the floor without fear of getting dirty. My striped suit was already completely filthy. I was getting up after having screwed the siphon back on when I noticed Frau Meyer standing close to me. She spoke in a whisper with a guilty air. She was the only one of 8 or 10 girls in the lab, German, Polish, and Ukrainian, who showed no contempt for me. Since my hands were already dirty, she asked, could I fix her bicycle, which had a flat? She would, of course,